Springfield, a small, picturesque town tucked away in the heartland, prided itself on the strength of its community, the charm of its streets, and the security of its tightly knit families. The Thompsons were one such family, a fixture in town, respected and admired. Their house, a colonial-style home on Maple Avenue, was as much a symbol of their success as it was of their carefully constructed image. Richard Thompson, the patriarch, was a successful architect, known for designing several key buildings in town. His reputation as a man of integrity and vision made him a sought-after professional, and his philanthropic contributions to Springfield only deepened the community's admiration for him. His wife, Martha, was equally beloved, teaching history at the local high school with a passion that captivated her students. At 50, she radiated warmth, always quick with a smile or a kind word. Their children, Jacob and Leah, were close in age, with only 2 years between them. Jacob, at 18, was set to attend a prestigious university to study engineering, following in his father's footsteps. Leah, 16, had a vibrant artistic streak that manifested in her paintings, many of which adorned the walls of their home. From the outside, they seemed like the perfect family, a cohesive unit bound by love, respect, and a shared sense of purpose. But behind closed doors, life was not as harmonious as it appeared. Beneath the polished veneer, tensions simmered, and secrets lurked, waiting to unravel the family's idyllic life. Jacob and Leah had always been close, their bond forged in the shared experiences of childhood and strengthened by their mutual understanding of their parents' high expectations. They confided in each other, supported each other, and had a connection that went beyond the usual sibling dynamic. As they entered their teenage years, however, their relationship began to take on an intensity that neither of them fully understood. At first, it was innocent, a lingering glance, an unspoken tension, a magnetic pull that they couldn't explain. They spent more time alone, retreating to their shared memories and private jokes, creating a world where only they existed. But gradually, this bond began to shift, moving into dangerous and uncharted territory. Jacob, usually calm and focused, found himself increasingly drawn to his sister, his feelings confusing and overwhelming. He tried to suppress them, to bury them beneath schoolwork, sports, and the responsibilities that came with preparing for college. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the thoughts that consumed him, thoughts that felt both wrong and irresistible. Leah, too, sensed the change in her brother. She noticed the way he looked at her, the way his presence made her heart race in a way she couldn't explain. She had always looked up to him, admired him, and sought his approval. But now she found herself yearning for something more, something that frightened her as much as it intrigued her. Her art, once a refuge, became an outlet for these complex emotions. She painted scenes that hinted at her inner turmoil, abstract landscapes that seemed to swirl with hidden meaning, expressions of feelings she couldn't voice. The intensity of their connection began to isolate them from others. Jacob withdrew from his friends, choosing to spend his free time with Leah instead of joining his peers. His friends noticed the change, but he brushed off their concerns, assuring them that he was simply focused on preparing for college. Leah, meanwhile, found herself pulling away from her own circle, retreating into her art, and avoiding questions about her increasingly reserved demeanor. Their parents, Richard and Martha, were too busy with their own lives to notice the subtle shifts in their children's behavior. Richard was engrossed in a major project, a new library for the town, which demanded his time and attention. Martha, juggling her teaching responsibilities and community work, trusted that her children were well-adjusted and thriving. The idea that something could be amiss never crossed their minds. But not everyone was oblivious. Mrs. Callahan, the elderly neighbor who had known the Thompsons since Jacob and Leah were toddlers, had a keen eye for detail. She often saw Jacob and Leah together in the backyard, their heads bent close in quiet conversation, their laughter private and intimate. There was something in their demeanor that unsettled her, something she couldn't quite place. She dismissed it as her imagination at first, but the unease lingered, nagging at her whenever she saw them together. As the months passed, the bond between Jacob and Leah grew stronger, more intense, and increasingly difficult to hide. They began to find excuses to be alone, creating spaces where they could share their thoughts without fear of judgment. These moments, stolen in quiet corners of the house or during long walks in the woods, became an addiction, a sanctuary where they could escape the boundaries imposed by the outside world. One evening in early summer, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jacob and Leah sat together in a secluded spot by the river, hidden from view by a canopy of trees. The air was thick with tension, unspoken words hanging between them as they sat in silence. Leah glanced at her brother, her heart pounding, and felt the weight of their unacknowledged feelings pressing down on her. "Jacob," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the water. "What are we doing?" He looked at her, his face etched with conflict, and for a moment, he seemed as lost as she felt. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice laced with guilt and longing. "But I can't stop. I don't know how to." Their confession, quiet and tentative, was a turning point. From that moment on, they became even more secretive, even more determined to protect the connection that bound them together. They found solace in each other, even as their relationship became a burden, a secret they carried alone. But secrets have a way of surfacing, and theirs was no exception. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, lost in their private world, they didn't notice Mrs. Callahan watching them from her kitchen window. She saw the way Jacob's hand lingered on Leah's shoulder, the way they looked at each other, and a chill ran down her spine. She couldn't deny what she had seen, couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. The next day, Mrs. Callahan called Martha, inviting her over for tea under the guise of a friendly visit. She carefully broached the subject, expressing her concern for Jacob and Leah, hinting at the closeness she had observed. Martha, taken aback, brushed it off, assuring Mrs. Callahan that her children were simply close siblings. But the seed of doubt was planted, and as Martha returned home, she couldn't shake the unease that had settled in her heart. In the following weeks, Martha began paying closer attention to her children, her mind alert for any signs that might confirm or dispel her suspicions. She watched them during family dinners, noticed the stolen glances, the way they always seemed to sit just a little too close. A quiet tension settled over the house, unspoken but palpable, as Martha's doubts grew. Jacob and Leah sensed the shift, felt the weight of their mother's gaze, and it only drove them deeper into secrecy. They became more careful, more guarded, but the pressure of their hidden relationship began to take its toll. Jacob became irritable, snapping at his parents and friends, retreating into himself. Leah, once cheerful and outgoing, grew distant, her grades slipping as her focus waned. The cracks in their perfect facade were beginning to show, and they knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. As they struggled to keep their relationship hidden, the fear of discovery loomed over them like a storm, casting a shadow over their lives. Unbeknownst to them, Detective Clara Hensley, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for intuition, had recently moved to Springfield and joined the local police department. She was drawn to small-town life, seeking a quieter, simpler existence after years of high-stakes cases in the city. But her instincts told her that there was more beneath the surface of Springfield's tranquil streets. When she first encountered the Thompsons at a community event, Clara's keen eye caught subtle details others missed: the tension in Jacob's posture, the guarded look in Leah's eyes, the strained smiles of Richard and Martha. Her intuition sparked, and though she had no reason to intervene, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. And so, the stage was set. Jacob and Leah, bound by a forbidden connection, struggled to navigate the weight of their secrets, unaware that their lives were on the verge of unraveling. Clara, guided by a sense of duty and curiosity, would soon find herself drawn into the hidden world of the Thompsons, a world where secrets festered and consequences loomed. Summer in Springfield brought a haze of warmth and long days, where the sun cast its golden light over the manicured lawns and blooming flower beds. But in the Thompson household, the oppressive heat seemed only to magnify the tensions simmering beneath the surface. Jacob and Leah were keenly aware that their mother had started watching them more closely, her gaze sharper, her questions more probing. Martha's newfound vigilance felt like an ever-present shadow, one that weighed on them with a silent, suffocating pressure. Jacob began to withdraw, his easygoing nature replaced by a defensive edge that his friends and family couldn't ignore. He skipped his usual summer activities, avoiding the pickup basketball games he once loved, the late-night bonfires with friends. Instead, he spent his time lingering near Leah, as if he could shield her from the outside world, as if together they could hide from the prying eyes that felt closer each day. For Leah, the toll was different but equally intense. Art, her only escape, became a place where her emotions spilled onto the canvas. She painted feverishly, filling page after page with abstract images that reflected her internal turmoil. Swirls of red and blue, shapes that looked like two figures entwined but forever reaching, struggling to stay connected despite the forces trying to pull them apart. But each brushstroke felt like a release and a wound, a way to express the emotions she couldn't voice, but also a painful reminder of the darkness that bound her to Jacob. One sweltering afternoon, as Leah was painting in her room, she heard her mother's voice calling from downstairs. There was an edge to it that made her stomach twist, a tension that seemed to seep through the walls. "Leah, come down here, please," Martha called, her voice clipped and controlled. Leah hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she set down her paintbrush. She glanced at her reflection in the mirror, her own eyes mirroring the fear she felt. She didn't know what awaited her downstairs, but she sensed that her mother's questions were becoming sharper, her curiosity more focused. When Leah entered the living room, she saw her mother standing by the window, her arms crossed and her gaze fixed on something beyond the glass. Martha's face was unreadable, but Leah could feel the tension radiating from her. "Sit down, Leah," Martha said, gesturing to the couch. Leah obeyed, her heart pounding as she waited, her eyes darting nervously around the room. She wanted to look anywhere but at her mother, whose piercing gaze felt like it could see right through her. "Leah, I've noticed that you and Jacob have been spending a lot of time together," Martha began, her tone deceptively casual. "More than usual, I'd say." Leah felt her throat tighten. She forced herself to meet her mother's gaze, but her mind raced, searching for an explanation that wouldn't betray the depth of her connection to Jacob. "We've always been close, Mom," Leah replied, keeping her voice steady. "It's normal for siblings to spend time together, isn't it?" Martha's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes narrowing. "Yes, of course. But this feels different. Ever since Jacob graduated, you two have been inseparable. I just want to make sure that everything is okay." Leah hesitated, feeling the weight of her mother's scrutiny. "We're fine, Mom," she said, attempting a reassuring smile. "Jacob's just been busy with his college preparations, and I think he wants to spend as much time with me as possible before he leaves." Martha studied her daughter's face, searching for any hint of deceit. After a long, tense moment, she nodded, though Leah could tell her mother wasn't entirely convinced. "All right, then. But Leah, remember that you can always talk to me about anything." Leah nodded, feeling a pang of guilt but knowing she couldn't reveal the truth. "I know, Mom. Thanks." As she left the living room, Leah's hands were clammy, and her heart raced with a mixture of relief and dread. She knew her mother's suspicions hadn't been fully dispelled, and it was only a matter of time before the pressure would intensify. That night, Leah confided her fears to Jacob. They met in the backyard under the cover of darkness, sitting on the stone bench beneath the old oak tree, where they'd shared countless secrets over the years. The warm summer breeze carried the scent of wildflowers, but the beauty of the night was lost on them, overshadowed by the weight of their secret. "Mom's starting to ask questions," Leah whispered, her voice trembling. "She knows something's different." Jacob clenched his fists, his jaw tight as he looked at his sister. Then we just have to be more careful. We can't let her, or anyone else, find out." Leah's eyes filled with uncertainty. "But Jacob, how much longer can we keep this up? We're already slipping. I can feel it." Jacob reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly. "We'll be okay, Leah. I'll figure something out. Just trust me." They sat in silence, the weight of their choices pressing down on them as they clung to each other, seeking solace in the connection that had become both their refuge and their prison. Days turned into weeks, and Martha's suspicions grew. She began to watch her children more closely, noting every shared glance, every moment of unspoken tension between them. She tried to shake off the nagging feeling, to dismiss it as paranoia, but something in her gut told her that there was more to Jacob and Leah's relationship than simple sibling closeness. Martha's unease was only compounded when she spoke to Mrs. Callahan, the neighbor who had first raised concerns. During a casual conversation over coffee, Mrs. Callahan mentioned that she had seen Jacob and Leah sneaking off together in the early hours, disappearing into the woods on the outskirts of town. "They're probably just going for a walk," Martha replied, trying to brush it off, but her voice lacked conviction. Mrs. Callahan gave her a skeptical look. "Martha, I know you love your children, but you can't ignore what's right in front of you. Something isn't right." That night, Martha lay awake in bed, her mind racing. She replayed the last few months in her mind. The way Jacob and Leah had become more isolated, more secretive. A quiet dread settled over her, and she resolved to get to the bottom of whatever was happening. In the meantime, Detective Clara Hensley's instincts about the Thompsons continued to nag at her. Since moving to Springfield, she had observed the family from a distance, her professional curiosity piqued by the subtle signs of strain she had detected. But without any concrete evidence, she couldn't justify prying into their lives. However, her resolve was tested when she crossed paths with Mrs. Callahan at the local grocery store. The elderly woman, always eager to share the latest town gossip, quickly filled Clara in on her suspicions about Jacob and Leah. Though Mrs. Callahan's tone was judgmental, Clara sensed an underlying concern, one that mirrored her own unease. That evening, Clara found herself parked outside the Thompson residence, wrestling with her conscience. She had no reason to be there, no legal grounds to investigate, but her instincts told her that something was amiss. She reminded herself that she had left city life for a quieter, simpler existence, yet the pull of a potential case was too strong to ignore. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a reddish glow over the town, Clara made her decision. She would watch, quietly and discreetly, and see if her intuition proved correct. If there was nothing to uncover, she would walk away. But if there was something more sinister beneath the surface, she would be there to intervene. Meanwhile, Jacob and Leah's world continued to shrink, their interactions clouded by fear and paranoia. They sensed their mother's increasing vigilance, felt the pressure of her gaze, and it only fueled their need for secrecy. Every moment together felt stolen, every shared glance a risk. They became adept at hiding their emotions, perfecting the art of pretending. One night, as they met by the river, a secluded spot where they could speak freely, Jacob's frustration boiled over. He clenched his fists, his face taut with anger and helplessness. "I can't stand this anymore, Leah," he muttered, his voice filled with desperation. "We're trapped. It feels like everyone's watching us, waiting for us to slip." Leah looked at him, her own face etched with sorrow. "I don't know what to do, Jacob. I don't want to lose you, but I don't know how much longer we can keep this up." Jacob's expression softened, and he reached out, pulling her close. "Then we'll figure it out together. I won't let anything happen to us. I promise." But even as he spoke, they both knew that the walls were closing in. Their choices, once made in innocence, had led them down a path that was becoming increasingly treacherous. And as they clung to each other, the darkness that surrounded them seemed to thicken, casting a shadow over their lives that would not be easily dispelled. Unbeknownst to them, Detective Clara Hensley sat in her car nearby, her gaze fixed on the two figures by the river, her instincts sharper than ever. She didn't know what lay between Jacob and Leah, but her intuition told her it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. The oppressive heat of summer began to give way to the cool, crisp air of early autumn, casting a golden hue over Springfield. But for Jacob and Leah, the change in seasons brought no relief. Their secret, once a source of solace, now weighed on them with an unbearable heaviness. Every whispered conversation, every stolen glance felt like a ticking time bomb, waiting to explode. They knew they were running out of places to hide, and each day that passed seemed to bring them closer to an inevitable reckoning. At school, Leah's teachers noticed a troubling change in her. Once a diligent and passionate student, she had become withdrawn and distracted. Her art, once bursting with color and energy, had turned dark, her canvases filled with shadowy figures and stormy landscapes that reflected her inner turmoil. Her art teacher, Mrs. Hamilton, took note of the drastic shift and decided to reach out. One afternoon, as the students packed up their supplies, Mrs. Hamilton approached Leah, her voice gentle but concerned. "Leah, can we talk for a moment?" Leah looked up, her expression blank, as if she hadn't heard. When Mrs. Hamilton repeated her question, Leah nodded, reluctantly following her to a quiet corner of the classroom. "Leah, I've noticed that your artwork has changed quite a bit recently," Mrs. Hamilton began, choosing her words carefully. "Is everything okay?" Leah fidgeted, her eyes darting around the room, avoiding her teacher's gaze. She wanted to confide in someone, anyone, but the shame and fear that gripped her were too overwhelming. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just dealing with a lot of things." Mrs. Hamilton's expression softened. "You know, art can be a powerful way to express what we're feeling, but sometimes we need more than just an outlet. If there's anything you need to talk about, I'm here." Leah forced a smile, but the sadness in her eyes was unmistakable. "Thank you, Mrs. Hamilton. I appreciate it." As she left the classroom, Leah felt a pang of regret. She wanted to reach out, to let someone in, but the fear of exposing her secret held her back. She knew that if the truth came out, it would destroy her family, her future, and the fragile connection she shared with Jacob. Meanwhile, Jacob's own behavior had become increasingly erratic. He was short-tempered and prone to bursts of anger, lashing out at anyone who tried to get close to him. His friends noticed the change, but his silence and defensiveness kept them at bay. To them, Jacob seemed like a young man burdened by the pressures of college preparations, but they sensed that there was more beneath the surface, something dark and unspoken. At home, the tension between Jacob and Leah was palpable, but they worked hard to keep up appearances. They exchanged polite smiles at the dinner table, careful not to draw attention to themselves, but the strain was evident to anyone who looked closely. Martha, still troubled by the conversation with Mrs. Callahan, observed her children with growing concern, unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As the weeks passed, Martha's unease turned to suspicion. She began checking on them more frequently, under the guise of concern for their well-being, but her questions grew sharper, her tone more probing. Every time she caught a glimpse of the shared glances between Jacob and Leah, her stomach twisted, and a quiet dread settled over her. One night, while her husband Richard was out of town for a business trip, Martha decided to confront Jacob. She found him in his room, studying, the glow of his desk lamp casting shadows across his face. She knocked softly, and when he looked up, his expression shifted from surprise to guardedness. "Mom," he said, his tone wary, "is everything okay?" Martha hesitated, searching for the right words. She didn't want to accuse him of anything, but she needed answers. "Jacob, I wanted to talk to you about you and Leah." He stiffened, his gaze dropping to the floor. "What about us?" Martha took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "I know you're both under a lot of pressure right now, with college and school and everything. But I've noticed that you two have been closer than usual." Jacob's jaw tightened, his fingers clenching around the edges of his notebook. She's my sister, Mom. We're close. Isn't that normal? Yes, it is, Martha replied, her voice soft but firm. But sometimes relationships can become complicated, especially when you're both going through so much. I just want to make sure that you're okay. Both of you. Jacob forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. We're fine, Mom. Really. Martha studied him, her heart heavy with worry. If there's ever anything you need to talk about, Jacob, anything at all, I'm here. He nodded, his expression unreadable, and as Martha left the room, a sense of helplessness washed over her. She wanted to believe him, but the unease gnawed at her, a constant reminder that something wasn't right. Unbeknownst to the Thompsons, Detective Clara Hensley had continued her quiet surveillance of the family. She'd seen Jacob and Leah slipping into the woods, their secret meetings by the river, the tension that seemed to radiate from their every interaction. Clara was torn, uncertain whether her instincts were leading her astray or if there was truly something dark beneath the surface. One evening, as Clara sat parked near the Thompson residence, she saw Jacob and Leah leaving the house together, their faces tense, their movements hurried. She followed them at a distance, her curiosity piqued as they made their way toward the secluded area by the river. When they reached the riverbank, Clara parked her car and approached quietly, hiding behind a cluster of trees as she watched the two siblings. Their conversation was too quiet for her to hear, but their body language told her everything she needed to know. They stood close, their heads bowed together, their expressions a mix of fear and desperation. Clara's heart raced, her instincts screaming that something was deeply, disturbingly wrong. She knew she had no grounds to interfere, no evidence of wrongdoing, but the pull of the mystery was too strong to ignore. She continued watching, waiting, hoping that her suspicions would be proven wrong. Back at the river, Jacob and Leah were locked in a whispered argument, their voices laced with tension. "We can't keep doing this, Jacob," Leah murmured, her voice trembling. "Mom's already suspicious. It's only a matter of time before she figures it out." Jacob's face hardened, a flicker of anger flashing in his eyes. "So what? Are you saying we should just give up? Pretend this never happened?" Leah shook her head, her eyes brimming with tears. "I don't know what I'm saying. I don't want to lose you, but I don't want to ruin everything either." Jacob's expression softened, and he reached out, pulling her into a tight embrace. "We'll figure it out, Leah. We'll find a way. Just don't give up on me." As they held each other, they felt the weight of their choices pressing down on them, a silent promise that neither could bring themselves to break, no matter the cost. The next day, Leah returned to school, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and guilt. She could feel the judgmental stares of her classmates, the whispers that seemed to follow her wherever she went. Though no one knew her secret, she felt as if they could see right through her, as if her shame was written across her face. In a moment of desperation, Leah decided to reach out to a friend. She approached her classmate, Lisa, during lunch, her voice barely above a whisper. "Lisa, can we talk?" Lisa looked at her, surprised by Leah's subdued tone. "Of course. What's going on?" Leah hesitated, struggling to find the words. She wanted to tell someone, to unburden herself of the secret that had consumed her life, but the fear of judgment held her back. "It's just, things at home have been really hard lately," Leah murmured, her gaze fixed on the table. "I feel like I'm trapped." Lisa's expression softened, her concern genuine. "I'm sorry, Leah. You can tell me anything. You know that, right?" Leah forced a smile, but the weight of her secret was too heavy. She shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "Thanks, Lisa. I don't know how to explain it." Later that evening, Leah returned home, feeling the crushing weight of isolation. She couldn't confide in anyone, couldn't escape the prison she had created with Jacob. Their connection, once a source of comfort, had become a trap, and she knew it was only a matter of time before the walls closed in. In her room, she picked up her paintbrush, her hand trembling as she began to paint. The colors blurred together, dark and chaotic, a reflection of the turmoil that consumed her. She painted until her hands ached, pouring her soul onto the canvas, desperate to find some semblance of release. But as she stepped back to look at her creation, a chill ran down her spine. The painting was a haunting depiction of two figures standing on the. Leah stared at the painting she had just completed, her breath catching as she took in the image before her. Two figures stood at the edge of a cliff, their backs turned to the viewer, facing a stormy, swirling abyss. Their hands were outstretched, reaching for each other, but their fingers just barely missed touching. The colors were dark and chaotic, streaks of red and black slashing across the canvas like wounds. It was as if her emotions had bled through the brushstrokes, creating a haunting portrait of their doomed connection. She took a step back, feeling both captivated and repelled by what she had created. The painting seemed to encapsulate everything she couldn't say out loud. All the fear, guilt, and longing that had consumed her since her relationship with Jacob had crossed a line they could never return from. A knock on her door startled her, and Leah quickly draped a cloth over the painting, hiding it from view. Her heart pounded as her mother's voice floated through the door. "Leah, honey, can I come in?" Leah took a deep breath, composing herself before she opened the door. Martha stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room, noting the hastily covered painting but choosing not to comment. She sat on the edge of Leah's bed, her expression soft but concerned. "I wanted to check on you," Martha said gently, her gaze settling on Leah. "You've seemed different lately. Is everything all right?" Leah forced a smile, her stomach churning with guilt. She knew her mother was trying to reach out, to understand, but how could she possibly explain the turmoil that had taken root in her life? "I'm fine, Mom. Just a lot on my mind," Leah replied, keeping her tone light. "School's been intense, and I guess I've just been preoccupied." Martha studied her, her brow furrowing slightly. "Leah, I know things haven't been easy lately, and I want you to know that you can tell me anything. I'm here for you, no matter what." Leah's throat tightened, and for a brief moment, she considered opening up, spilling the truth that had been suffocating her for so long. But the fear of her mother's reaction, the shame of revealing the depth of her feelings for Jacob, held her back. "Thanks, Mom," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll be okay. I just need a little time." Martha nodded, though the concern in her eyes didn't fade. She reached out, gently squeezing Leah's hand. "All right, sweetheart. Just remember, I'm here whenever you need me." As her mother left the room, Leah let out a shaky breath, the weight of her secret pressing down on her with renewed intensity. She felt trapped, like a caged animal, with no way out and no one to turn to. The walls were closing in, and the pressure of keeping up appearances was becoming unbearable. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling as her thoughts spiraled. The bond she shared with Jacob, once a source of solace, now felt like a curse. They were bound together by something dark and destructive, something that could only end in tragedy. She knew it, and yet she couldn't bring herself to sever the connection. She was too deeply entangled, too afraid of losing him. Meanwhile, across town, Detective Clara Hensley was piecing together the fragments of the mystery surrounding the Thompsons. Her surveillance had yielded little concrete evidence, but the behavior she had observed between Jacob and Leah gnawed at her, an itch she couldn't ignore. There was something profoundly unsettling about their interactions, something that defied the usual dynamics of sibling relationships. Clara spent hours reviewing her notes, retracing her observations, and analyzing every detail. She had seen enough cases in her career to recognize the signs of an unhealthy attachment, and her instincts told her that Jacob and Leah were hiding something that could tear their family apart. But without proof, she knew she couldn't confront them directly. She needed something tangible, something undeniable. Her opportunity came sooner than she expected. One evening, as Clara was reviewing her notes at the police station, she received a call from Mrs. Callahan, the elderly neighbor who had first raised concerns about the Thompsons. Mrs. Callahan's voice was laced with urgency, her words tumbling out in a hurried whisper. "Detective Hensley, I saw something tonight. Something disturbing." Clara's grip on the phone tightened. "What did you see, Mrs. Callahan?" The woman hesitated, as if reluctant to speak. "I saw Jacob and Leah in the woods. They were arguing, and he grabbed her. It looked like he was trying to stop her from leaving." Clara's heart raced. "Are you certain?" "Yes," Mrs. Callahan replied, her voice trembling. "They were shouting, and Leah looked scared. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I know what I saw." Clara thanked Mrs. Callahan and ended the call, her mind racing. She had suspected that the relationship between Jacob and Leah was strained, but this was the first indication of something truly alarming. If Jacob was becoming aggressive, then the situation was more serious than she had anticipated. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Clara drove to the Thompson residence, parking a discreet distance away. She watched as the lights flickered on and off inside the house, shadows moving behind the curtains. She knew she couldn't confront them directly, not without evidence, but she resolved to keep a closer eye on them. Whatever was happening between Jacob and Leah, she was certain it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. Inside the house, tensions were reaching a boiling point. Jacob's frustration had turned to anger, a volatile mix of jealousy and possessiveness that he struggled to control. He hated the distance that had grown between him and Leah, hated the way she seemed to pull away from him whenever they were together. The bond that had once brought them comfort had become a source of pain, a twisted, obsessive attachment that consumed his thoughts. One evening, as Leah was returning from school, Jacob intercepted her in the hallway, his expression intense and unyielding. "Why are you avoiding me?" he demanded, his voice low and strained. "You barely talk to me anymore. What happened to us?" Leah took a step back, her heart pounding as she met his gaze. "Jacob, this has to stop. Whatever's between us, it's wrong. We can't keep doing this." Jacob's face twisted in anger, and he grabbed her arm, his grip tightening as he pulled her closer. "You don't mean that," he whispered, his voice filled with desperation. "We're meant to be together. You know that as well as I do." Leah's eyes filled with tears as she struggled to break free. "Jacob, please, let me go. This isn't right. We're destroying ourselves." His grip slackened, and he released her, a look of anguish crossing his face. "I can't lose you, Leah. You're all I have." She took a step back, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Jacob, if you really care about me, you have to let me go. We have to end this before it's too late." As she turned and walked away, Jacob stood frozen, his mind reeling. He couldn't imagine a life without her, couldn't bear the thought of losing the only person who understood him. But as he watched her retreating figure, he realized that his love for her had become a cage, trapping them both in a destructive cycle they couldn't escape. Desperation clouded his thoughts, and he began to contemplate drastic measures. If he couldn't have her, then maybe there was a way to keep her by his side forever. The idea took root in his mind, a dark seed that grew with each passing day, feeding on his anger and fear. Meanwhile, Leah confided in Lisa, her closest friend, unable to keep her emotions bottled up any longer. She didn't reveal the full extent of her relationship with Jacob, but she hinted at the turmoil that had consumed her life, her voice shaking as she spoke. "Lisa, I don't know what to do. I feel like I'm drowning, like there's no way out." Lisa's face softened, her concern evident. "Leah, whatever it is, you don't have to face it alone. You can talk to me, or even a counselor. There are people who can help." Leah nodded, though she knew that no one could truly understand the darkness that had taken hold of her. She was trapped, bound to Jacob by a connection that was both her comfort and her curse. And as she walked away from her friend, she felt a growing sense of dread, an inescapable feeling that something terrible was about to happen. Detective Clara Hensley, watching from a distance, felt the same sense of impending doom. She had seen enough in her years as an investigator to recognize the signs of a tragedy in the making, and her instincts told her that the Thompsons were on the brink of something catastrophic. But as she continued her quiet surveillance, she knew that there was little she could do, at least not yet. All she could do was wait, watching as the pieces fell into place, hoping that she would be able to act before it was too late. And so, the Thompsons' lives continued to unravel, their secrets spiraling toward an inevitable conclusion. Jacob and Leah, bound by a love that defied the boundaries of family, were hurtling toward a tragedy that would shatter the world they had tried so desperately to protect. The chill of autumn had settled over Springfield, casting the town in shades of gray and gold as leaves fell in swirling patterns. The picturesque backdrop seemed at odds with the storm brewing within the Thompson household. Jacob and Leah's once close relationship had become a fragile, toxic bond, teetering on the edge of collapse. The weight of their secrets, their shared shame and fear, was pulling them under, and the cracks were widening, threatening to expose the darkness that had taken root in their lives. Leah's sleep became fitful, haunted by nightmares that left her drenched in cold sweat. She dreamed of running through dark woods, Jacob's voice calling after her, a twisted mixture of longing and desperation. She could feel him closing in, and when she tried to scream, her voice was swallowed by the shadows. Each time she awoke, her heart pounding, she felt the inescapable dread that something terrible was about to happen. She wasn't the only one plagued by unease. Jacob's behavior had grown increasingly erratic, his mood swinging from sullen silence to explosive anger. At school, his teachers noticed the change, and his friends began to distance themselves, wary of his unpredictable temper. Even Richard, his father, commented on his son's strange behavior, but Jacob brushed it off, claiming he was stressed about college. But Martha knew better. Her mother's intuition told her that something far more sinister was at play. She watched her children with a mixture of love and fear, noticing the tension that crackled between them. She recalled the hushed conversations she'd had with Mrs. Callahan, the disturbing observations of her neighbor, and felt a quiet horror growing within her. It was as if she were watching a slow-motion tragedy, helpless to intervene as her family slipped into darkness. One evening, unable to bear the silence any longer, Martha decided to confront Leah directly. She found her daughter sitting in her room, staring at a half-finished painting. Leah looked up, startled, as her mother entered, her face pale and drawn. "Leah," Martha said softly, sitting down beside her, "I know things have been difficult lately, and I know something's wrong between you and Jacob. I need you to tell me what's going on. Please." Leah's hands trembled, her mind racing as she searched for the words. She wanted to tell her mother everything, to confess the weight of her secret and beg for help. But the shame was too great, and the fear of her mother's reaction paralyzed her. "It's nothing, Mom," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Just stress from school. That's all." Martha reached out, placing a gentle hand on Leah's shoulder. "Sweetheart, I know you're lying. I can see it in your eyes. Whatever it is, you don't have to face it alone. I'm here for you." Leah looked away, her throat tightening as tears filled her eyes. She wanted to believe her mother's words, to trust that she could share the truth without destroying her family. But the bond she shared with Jacob, twisted and broken as it was, felt unbreakable. She couldn't abandon him, couldn't betray the connection that had defined her life. "I'm fine, Mom," she said again, her voice a hollow echo. "Really, there's nothing to worry about." Martha's shoulders sagged, her heart heavy with sorrow. She knew her daughter was hiding something, but without proof, without Leah's trust, she was powerless to help. With a sigh, she left the room, leaving Leah alone with her guilt and fear. As the days passed, the atmosphere in the Thompson household grew increasingly strained. Jacob and Leah barely spoke, each retreating into their own private torment. Leah found herself avoiding her brother, afraid of the darkness she saw in his eyes, the possessive intensity that had begun to frighten her. She threw herself into her art, desperate to escape the weight of her emotions, But even that refuge was beginning to crumble. One afternoon, as Leah was walking home from school, she heard hurried footsteps behind her. She turned, her heart skipping a beat as she saw Jacob approaching, his face set in a determined expression. "We need to talk," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Leah swallowed, glancing around nervously. "Jacob, please, not here." He grabbed her arm, steering her toward a secluded path that led to the woods. Leah felt a surge of panic, her heart racing as she allowed herself to be led, sensing that something was about to go terribly wrong. When they were far enough from prying eyes, Jacob released her, his gaze intense and unyielding. "Why are you avoiding me?" he demanded, his voice low and strained. "You barely look at me anymore. What's changed?" Leah looked down, unable to meet his gaze. "Jacob, this has to stop. We can't keep doing this. It's tearing us apart." His face twisted with anger and desperation. "Don't say that. Don't you dare say that. You're the only person who understands me, Leah. You're all I have." She took a shaky step back, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I can't be that for you, Jacob. This isn't right. We need to move on. You're going to college soon, and I need to focus on my life." Jacob's hands clenched into fists, his face contorted with pain. "So that's it. You're just going to leave me. Pretend that none of this ever happened." Tears filled Leah's eyes as she looked at him, her heart breaking. "I don't want to lose you, but I can't keep living like this. It's destroying me, Jacob. Please, understand that." For a moment, Jacob's face softened, and she thought she saw a glimmer of understanding. But then his expression hardened, and he took a step forward, his eyes dark with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. "If you leave me, Leah, I don't know what I'll do," he whispered, his voice filled with a quiet menace. "I can't live without you, and if I can't have you, then no one will." The words hung in the air, a threat that filled Leah with a sickening dread. She took another step back, her hands trembling as she tried to process what he had just said. This wasn't the Jacob she had grown up with, the brother who had once been her confidant and protector. This was someone else, a stranger twisted by jealousy and obsession. Without another word, Leah turned and ran, her heart pounding as she fled through the woods, branches scratching at her arms and face as she pushed her way forward. She could hear Jacob calling after her, his voice laced with anger, but she didn't stop. She didn't dare look back. When she finally reached her house, she slammed the door behind her, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. Her mother looked up, startled by her daughter's disheveled appearance. "Leah, what happened?" Martha asked, rushing over to her. Leah shook her head, unable to speak. She felt like she was unraveling, the weight of her secret crushing her from all sides. She wanted to tell her mother everything, to finally unburden herself of the nightmare that had consumed her life. But the fear of Jacob's threat, of what he might do if she exposed their secret, held her back. "I'm fine, Mom," she whispered, her voice hollow. "Just had a rough day." Martha didn't press, though her eyes were filled with worry. She could sense that something was terribly wrong, but Leah's walls were too high, her silence too impenetrable. That night, as Leah lay in bed, her mind replayed Jacob's words, the quiet menace in his voice that had chilled her to the bone. She knew she couldn't keep living like this, trapped in a cycle of fear and shame. She had to break free, had to find a way to escape the toxic bond that held her captive. The following day, Leah gathered her courage and made an appointment with the school counselor, determined to seek help. She didn't plan to reveal everything, but she hoped that talking to someone, anyone, might provide some clarity, some way out of the nightmare she had created with Jacob. But as she sat in the counselor's office, waiting for her turn, she felt a creeping sense of dread, as if she were being watched. She glanced around, her heart skipping a beat as she spotted Jacob standing outside, his gaze fixed on her through the window, his face twisted with anger and betrayal. The sight sent a chill down her spine, and she realized, with a sinking feeling, that there was no escaping him. He wouldn't let her go, wouldn't allow her to sever the bond that bound them together. She was trapped, and the walls were closing in. Desperate and afraid, Leah left the counselor's office without saying a word, her mind racing as she tried to find a solution, a way to escape Jacob's grasp. But no matter where she turned, she felt his presence, his shadow looming over her, a constant reminder that he would never let her go. And as she walked home that evening, the air thick with the promise of rain, she couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen, something that would shatter their lives forever. The tension in Springfield had become palpable, an invisible weight that hung over the town. The people who knew the Thompsons sensed that something was wrong, but no one could have guessed the depth of the turmoil brewing within their seemingly perfect family. The whispers of unease grew louder, spreading through the town like wildfire. But to those closest to the family, the signs were hidden beneath polite smiles and carefully crafted facades. Leah's mind was a storm of confusion, fear, and shame. Every night, she lay awake, haunted by memories of Jacob's words, the quiet, possessive threat that had sent a chill through her bones. She felt like a prisoner, trapped in a relationship that had once been her solace, but had become her curse. The love she felt for her brother, twisted and warped, was now a burden she could no longer bear. The following week, the Thompsons hosted a family dinner, a rare occasion when Richard was home from his business trips. They sat around the table, the four of them, in a silence that felt heavy and strained. Leah picked at her food, her gaze focused on her plate, while Jacob sat across from her, his eyes never leaving her face. Martha and Richard exchanged glances, sensing the tension between their children, but unsure of how to address it. Finally, Richard cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "So, Jacob, how's the college prep going? Excited for the next chapter?" Jacob forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, Dad, it's exciting." His gaze flickered to Leah, an unreadable expression crossing his face. "But there's still a lot to figure out." Leah felt his words like a weight pressing down on her chest, her hands trembling as she set down her fork. She could feel his possessive energy, the way he seemed to be silently demanding her attention, even in the presence of their parents. She glanced at her mother, who was watching her with a look of concern, but she couldn't bring herself to meet Martha's gaze. Sensing the unease in the room, Martha reached over and placed a hand on Leah's shoulder, her touch gentle but firm. "Sweetheart, you've been so quiet lately. Is everything all right?" Leah swallowed, the words trapped in her throat. She wanted to scream, to tell her mother everything, to confess the darkness that had consumed her life. But the fear of Jacob's reaction, the threat he had whispered in her ear, held her captive. She felt his eyes on her, a silent warning, and she forced a smile. "I'm fine, Mom," she said softly, her voice barely audible. "Just a lot on my mind." Martha's eyes lingered on her daughter, filled with a worry that bordered on desperation. She could sense that Leah was holding something back, something dark and painful, but every time she tried to reach out, Leah pulled away, retreating further into herself. That night, as the family dispersed to their respective rooms, Leah lay in bed, her mind racing. She couldn't keep living like this, couldn't continue pretending that everything was normal. She knew that Jacob's obsession was spiraling out of control, that his love had transformed into something toxic and dangerous. She had to find a way to escape, to free herself from the chains of their twisted bond. But as she closed her eyes, exhausted and defeated, she heard a faint knock on her door. Her heart sank as she recognized the sound. Jacob's quiet, familiar knock. She lay still, hoping he would go away. But after a moment, the door creaked open, and he slipped into the room, his presence filling the space with an oppressive weight. "Leah," he whispered, his voice a mixture of desperation and anger. "Why are you pulling away from me? Why are you trying to leave?" She sat up, her body tense, as she met his gaze. "Jacob, please, you have to understand. This isn't right. We're hurting each other. We have to let go." His face twisted with anguish, and he took a step closer, his hands clenched into fists. "No, I won't lose you, Leah. You're the only person who understands me, who cares about me. I can't live without you." Leah's voice trembled as she spoke, her fear bubbling to the surface. "Jacob, you have to let me go. This, whatever this is, it's destroying us." For a moment, Jacob's expression softened, and she thought she saw a glimmer of understanding. But then his face hardened, his eyes darkening as he moved closer, his voice barely a whisper. "If you leave me, Leah, I don't know what I'll do. I can't live in a world without you. And if I can't have you, then no one will." His words sent a chill down her spine, a feeling of dread seeping into her bones. She realized, with a sinking certainty, that he was serious. This was no idle threat. Jacob's obsession had become a dark, consuming force, one that he couldn't control. Desperate and terrified, Leah made a decision. She would leave. She didn't know where she would go, but she had to escape, to free herself from Jacob's grasp before it was too late. She packed a small bag, her hands shaking as she stuffed it with clothes, her heart pounding as she prepared to slip away into the night. But as she reached the front door, she heard a voice behind her. "Going somewhere?" She froze, turning to see Jacob standing at the top of the stairs, his face twisted with anger and betrayal. His eyes were dark, filled with a possessiveness that bordered on madness, and Leah felt a wave of panic wash over her. "Jacob, please, I need to get out of here. I can't stay anymore," she stammered, her voice trembling. He descended the stairs slowly, his gaze never leaving her, his movements deliberate and menacing. "You think you can just walk away? After everything we've been through? I told you, Leah, you're mine. I won't let you leave me." Leah backed away, her mind racing as she tried to think of an escape. She glanced toward the door, calculating her chances of making it outside before he could reach her. But Jacob seemed to sense her intentions, and in an instant he lunged, grabbing her arm and pulling her close, his grip bruising. "You're not going anywhere," he hissed, his voice filled with a desperate rage. "If you won't stay with me, then there's only one way out." Leah struggled, her heart pounding as she fought against his hold. She could feel the strength of his grip, the intensity of his determination, and she knew, with a sickening certainty, that he was willing to do whatever it took to keep her by his side. In a final act of desperation, she broke free, stumbling backward and reaching for the nearest object she could find. A heavy vase on the hallway table. She raised it, her hands shaking, her gaze locked on Jacob as he advanced, his eyes filled with an unholy light. "Don't make me do this, Jacob," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But he didn't stop. He kept moving toward her, his expression twisted with a possessive fury that chilled her to the bone. And then, in a single terrible moment, she brought the vase down, the sound of shattering glass echoing through the house as Jacob crumpled to the floor, blood pooling around him. Leah stood frozen, the vase slipping from her grasp as the reality of what she had done washed over her. She fell to her knees beside him, her hands trembling as she touched his face, her mind reeling with shock and horror. "Jacob, I'm so sorry," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry." The front door burst open, and Martha and Richard rushed in, drawn by the sound of the commotion. They stopped, their faces pale with shock as they took in the scene. Their son lying motionless on the floor, their daughter sobbing beside him, blood staining her hands. For a moment, no one spoke, the silence stretching out like a chasm. And then, with a strangled cry, Martha rushed forward, pulling Leah into her arms, holding her as she wept. Detective Clara Hensley arrived shortly after, having received a frantic call from Mrs. Callahan, who had heard the shouting from her home next door. As Clara surveyed the scene, piecing together the tragic culmination of the Thompsons' secrets, she felt a deep sadness settle over her. The truth had come to light, but at a terrible cost. In the days that followed, The town of Springfield mourned the loss of the boy they thought they knew, the family they thought was perfect. The Thompsons became the subject of hushed conversations and whispers, a cautionary tale of love, obsession, and tragedy. And Leah, forever haunted by the memory of her brother's final words, carried the weight of her actions with her, a silent, unending reminder of the bond that had both saved and destroyed her.